Hello and welcome to Talk to Rachel, or welcome to Rachel's Book Club. Esse mês estamos lendo esse livro aqui, Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Esse livro é o livro adaptado do original, da clássico britânico. Esse livro estamos lendo em 3 partes. Hoje eu vou ler a última parte junto com vocês. E se você quer acompanhar, você precisa entrar no meu grupo de Telegram para você ler junto com a transcript, com a transcrição, com o glossary, com todas as coisas que eu coloco lá para ajudar vocês a acompanhar essa história, ok? Então vamos para Part 3, mas se você perdeu Part 1, Part 2, você pode encontrar eles facilmente lá no meu canal do YouTube. Let's go! Part 3, Chapter 6. Soon after this, their brother, Mr. John Dashwood, came to see them at Mrs. Jennings' house. Colonel Brandon was there too that morning. "And so you're all happy in your new little home at Barton. Edward told us all about it. I must meet the Middletons. Will you take me to meet them, Eleanor?" Eleanor agreed. It was a fine day, and they could walk the short way to the Middletons' house. "Colonel Brandon seems to be a good sort of man, a gentleman. Does he have money?" "Yes, and a large house." "Wonderful! He'll be a good husband for you, Eleanor." "For me?" Eleanor asked in surprise. "Oh yes, I watched him. He looked at you a lot." "No," Eleanor said, "he doesn't want to marry me." "You're wrong, Eleanor, wrong. You must try. You haven't got much money, it's true, but he'll have you, I'm sure. We'll all be very happy for you. Perhaps my sister and Fanny's brother will both marry at the same time." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked quickly. "Is Edward going to marry someone?" "We think so. Yes, very soon. His mother has found the right young lady for him. Her name is Miss Morton, and she is very rich. And money is so useful. Everything is so very expensive now. We need more money for Norland." "Yes, John, but you're not poor." "Well, we're not rich. We're making a new flower garden, and of course we had to buy more furniture. Your mother took so much with her. Now, what is the matter with Marianne?" "She doesn't look very well. She must be careful if she wants to find a husband." Lady Middleton and Mrs. John Dashwood were soon the best of friends. They were both selfish women. The Dashwoods invited the Middletons to dinner with Eleanor, Marianne, Mrs. Jennings, the Miss Steeles, and Colonel Brandon. They invited Mrs. Ferriers too. "Oh, Eleanor, I'm so anxious. Only you can understand this. I shall soon meet my new mother," Lucy Steele said, entering the Dashwoods' house. "Not yours, but Miss Morton's, perhaps," Eleanor thought. Edward was not there. She was pleased. He was in London already, but could not come that evening. Mrs. Ferriers was a little thin woman with a serious and quite unpleasant face. She did not say much, but looked at Eleanor with dislike. There were many servants, and the dinner was an expensive one. Later, in the sitting room, John Dashwood showed one of Eleanor's pictures to Colonel Brandon. "How well Eleanor paints," he said. The Colonel agreed. "Yes," said Fanny. "Look, Mother, have you seen Miss Dashwood's picture?" "Very pretty," Mrs. Ferriers said coldly, and did not look at it. "It's a little like one of Miss Morton's pictures, isn't it?" Fanny continued. "She paints beautifully," Mrs. Ferriers said, more warmly now. Miss Morton does everything well." Marianne didn't like this. "Well, and who is this Morton, Miss Morton? What does she matter? Eleanor is here. We are talking about her, not Miss Morton." Mrs. Ferriers and Fanny were both very angry, but Colonel Brandon looked lovingly at Marianne. She put her arm around her sister and said quietly, "Dear, dear Eleanor, don't be unhappy." And then she began to cry. "Oh, poor girl," Mrs. Jennings said. "Poor Marianne," her brother said to Colonel Brandon. "She was quite beautiful a few months ago, but now it's all gone." Lucy Steele was very excited. She came to see Eleanor the next morning. "I'm so happy," she said. "Mrs. Ferrars was so kind to me. Did you notice? Everything will be all right. I know it will." Marianne still didn't know anything about Edward and Lucy's engagement. "I must tell her soon," Eleanor thought. The time for this came very quickly. One morning, Mrs. Jennings hurried back into the house after her shopping. "Have you heard the news?" she asked Eleanor. "Oh, it's so strange. Edward Ferrars and Lucy Steele are secretly engaged. And now Mrs. Ferrars has heard about it. She is very, very angry. She has a rich young lady ready for Edward. Your sister Fanny shouted at Lucy. Lucy cried, and Mrs. Ferrars has sent Edward out of the house. She's not going to give him any money. She's going to give it all to Robert." Robert, Edward's younger brother, was a well-dressed but quite stupid young man. "Lucy isn't rich, but she's my relative and a nice young lady," Mrs. Jennings continued. "Why can't they marry?" "Well, Edward is keeping his promise. He won't break the engagement. He has told his mother this. Poor young man, if he has no home, he can stay here." Eleanor went to Marianne. "How long ago did you hear about their engagement?" Marianne asked. She and Eleanor were both crying now. 4 months ago." 4 months, and you said nothing to me. All the time I was so unhappy and you were so kind to me. Oh, Eleanor." "I wanted to say something, but it was a secret, and perhaps they will be happy together." "I hope so." "How can you forget him so easily? Is your heart so hard?" "Marianne, I do feel strongly for Edward. Yes, I loved him, and it was very painful. Fanny, Lucy and Mrs. Ferrars have all hurt me too. But I couldn't say anything. I had to try to be calm and to help you. Please, Marianne, say nothing and be polite to Lucy and Edward." Marianne kissed her sister warmly and promised. Chapter 7. Marianne wanted to go home very much now, after 2 months in London. It was a long journey, quite difficult and expensive, but luckily Mrs. Jennings offered them her help. Her other daughter, Charlotte, lived at Cleveland, only 1 day's journey from Barton, their home. Mrs. Jennings wanted to visit her for Easter. "We can travel there together," she told the girls, "and stay a few days. Then your mother can send her servant for you. Colonel Brandon is coming too. We shall have a happy time." "Oh no," Marianne said to Eleanor, "I can't go there. Cleveland is in Somerset. Willoughby's home is near there." Eleanor talked about their mother. "We shall see her very soon," and at last Marianne agreed. But first Colonel Brandon came to see Eleanor about Edward. "I don't know Mr. Ferrars very well," he said, "but I met him a few times and liked him. He's going to be a priest, isn't he? Well, I can offer him work in my church at Delaford. The money is not much and the house is quite small, but it's better than nothing. Will you tell him?" Eleanor was very surprised, but she agreed. That same morning she took pen and paper and began to write him a letter. Then suddenly the door opened and Edward came in. They both found it difficult to speak. "You're leaving London," he said. "I wanted to say goodbye to you." Eleanor explained the Colonel's offer to him. "The Colonel has asked me to be his priest. Is it possible?" "You still have friends. Are you surprised?" "No, you were always a good friend." "It is really Colonel Brandon's idea, not mine," Eleanor replied, "but I'm very pleased about it." "I'll go and see him immediately," Edward said, jumping up. "And now he can marry Lucy," thought Eleanor sadly. Eleanor visited her brother for the last time in London. "Has Colonel Brandon really given the job of priest to Edward? Why did he do that?" "He wanted to help Mr. Ferrars." "Well, Edward is a very lucky man, and now he will marry Lucy, but Mrs. Ferrars mustn't hear about it." "Of course she'll hear about it," Eleanor said. "Oh, but she'd be so unhappy. Edward is still her son." "But she's forgotten that, hasn't she?" No, she's the most loving mother in the world." Eleanor was silent. "Possibly," her brother continued, "Mr. Robert Ferrars will marry Miss Morton now." Can't she choose? Asked Eleanor. Or are Robert and Edward the same to her? Of course it's the same thing. Robert will have all the money now. Early on an April morning, they began their journey to Cleveland and arrived there after 3 days. The house was large and modern, with beautiful trees around it. Marianne enjoyed walking among those trees, thinking sadly of Willoughby and his house only 30 miles away. She walked through the wet grass and far away into the wilder part of the park. After 4 days, she caught a terrible cold. At first, Eleanor was not worried. Marianne must go to bed and sleep all night. Then she'll be better in the morning, she told Colonel Brandon. He was much too anxious about her. For a few days, it was just an ordinary cold. But then Marianne got much worse. She had a terrible headache and a fever and began to say strange things. Is Mother coming? She asked anxiously. She lay heavily in her bed. It was about midnight. Oh, but if she goes round by London, I shan't see her. It's too far. Eleanor sent for the doctor immediately. Her sister looked very ill. And who could go for their mother? I'll go, said Colonel Brandon, and left at once. Eleanor sat with Marianne all night. The doctor didn't come until 5 o'clock in the morning. It's a dangerous fever, he said, but he couldn't really help her. Everyone was very frightened now. She's a beautiful young girl, Mrs. Jennings cried. She can't die so young. Eleanor tried to stay calm, but it was too much for her. The doctor came again. No, she's not better, he said. Marianne was unnaturally quiet now and sleeping heavily. Perhaps I can still help her. I'll give her some different pills. By about midday, Marianne was a little stronger and the fever not so bad. By 4 o'clock, she was much better. She's out of danger now, said the doctor, and Marianne began to sleep more comfortably. Eleanor ate some tea with Mrs. Jennings, their first meal of the day. Then Mrs. Jennings went up to bed. They were both very tired, but Eleanor wanted to wait for her mother. She heard a carriage outside, but it was only 8 o'clock. Her mother and Colonel Brandon could not possibly arrive until 10. Who was it? The door opened and Willoughby walked in. I must talk to you, Miss Dashwood, and I must not talk with you, Mr. Willoughby. Please, it's very important. I've come all the way from London today. Today? Eleanor surprised. Well then, sit down and tell me your business at once, but please be quick. How is your sister? Is the fever really better now? Your servant told me. Is it true? Yes, we hope it is. And now, Miss Dashwood, am I a bad man or a stupid man? Bad? That's what you think, isn't it? But no, I'm not really bad, only stupid, and I'm very sorry. I want to tell you everything. He told her his story. He didn't mean to love Marianne. She was a pretty girl and he amused himself with her at first. Then he started to love her seriously. He planned to marry her. But his old aunt, who lived near Barton, heard something terrible about him. He once took a young woman away from her husband and then left her when she was having his baby. If this is true, Allen House will never be yours, she told Willoughby. It was true. He had very little money and was waiting for his aunt's house to be his. I have always spent a lot of money, he told Eleanor now. It's not good, I know. My happiest hours were with your sister and I loved her, but I couldn't live without money. And so I decided to forget her and to marry Miss Grey. My heart was hard then. Then of course I saw you in London and that was terrible. Marian's sweet face. Did you see the letter? The letter that you wrote to her? Yes. My wife wrote it. She found Marianne's letters and was very angry. I held the pen, but they were all her words. This is wrong, Eleanor said. Don't talk about your wife like that. You chose her. You chose all this. My wife didn't love me then, and she doesn't love me now. I heard about Marianne's illness, and at once my love for her came back into my heart. I love only her, but she will never be mine now. Will you tell her all this? I hurt her badly, but I have also hurt myself. Am I still a very bad man? What do you think? I'll tell her something, and I'm sorry for you, Mr. Willoughby. Perhaps he was not a very bad man, but he was a weak and selfish one, and he liked money too much. Eleanor sat thinking hard while she waited for her mother. At last Mrs. Dashwood arrived with Colonel Brandon. She was very frightened, but Eleanor quickly told her the good news that Marianne was better, and she ran upstairs to see her. She held her daughter in her arms and offered to sit with her all night. Eleanor was glad to agree. She needed to sleep now. Her mother had something more to say the next morning. Eleanor, Colonel Brandon opened his heart to me yesterday and told me about his love for Marianne. We were both in the carriage and so frightened about her fever. It was natural to speak about our feelings for her. Oh, he is a good, unselfish man. Yes, Eleanor replied, he is. If Marianne agrees to marry him, I'm sure they'll be very happy. What did you say to him? I encouraged him. You need time, just time, Colonel. I told him. Marianne won't think about Willoughby forever. Well, he's not so sure, but he's ready to wait. She'll be very near me at Delaford. The Colonel is not as handsome as Willoughby, but he's a much better man. Every day now Marianne got a little better, and at last they were able to return to their house at Barton. Marianne was happy to be home again, but remembering everything was painful too. She went to her piano and picked up some music, but it was a book of music with Willoughby's name in it, and she couldn't play it. Well, Eleanor, she said, I'll be stronger soon, and then I shall study seriously. I shall read for 6 hours every day and practice the piano. I'll learn a lot this way. Eleanor smiled. One morning she took Marianne out for a walk. Marianne looked up at the hill behind the house and said, I first saw Willoughby there. I can talk about it now. Most of the pain has gone. But I would like to know, did he really love me? Or was it all a terrible mistake? Eleanor told her about Willoughby's visit. Marianne turned white, but said, Thank you, oh thank you. It will be easier now. Soon Margaret returned from a visit, and Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters were together again in their home. Then one day one of the servants returned from the nearest town and said, Mr. Ferris is married. Did you know? Marianne began to cry, and Eleanor looked terrible. Mrs. Dashwood saw the pain on her face and began to question the servant. Who told you this? I saw Mr. Ferris and his new wife, Miss Lucy Steele. Their carriage stopped outside the hotel. Miss Steele, well, Mrs. Ferris now, told me. I've changed my name, she said. Mr. Ferris didn't say much. Where were they going? They came from London and they were travelling west. They're probably going to visit Lucy's uncle, Eleanor said quietly. She looked very well, a servant continued, and very happy too. She's a handsome young woman. Eleanor had no hope now. Before this day there was always just a little hope. But now Edward was married, and so quickly too. He wasn't a priest yet. And then through the window they saw a man on a horse. Was it the Colonel? He was coming to visit them very soon. But no, it was Edward. Everyone saw and waited silently. I will be calm, Eleanor told herself. Edward looked white and anxious too, but Mrs. Dashwood gave him her hand. We hope you will be very happy, she said. Eleanor began to talk about the weather. Then she had nothing more to say, so Mrs. Dashwood spoke again. Is Mrs. Ferris well? Is she with her uncle now? She's well, thank you, but with her uncle. He looked surprised. No, my mother is in London. My mother is talking about Mrs. Edward Ferris, said Eleanor. Perhaps, Edward said, Perhaps you mean Mrs. Robert Ferris. Mrs. Robert Ferris, Marianne and her mother said together, but Eleanor could not speak. Yes, my brother and Miss Lucy Steele are married now. Perhaps you haven't heard. Eleanor jumped to her feet and ran out of the room. 3 hours later, she and Edward were engaged, and he was the happiest man in the world. He told her all about his engagement to Lucy. I was staying with her uncle some years ago, he said, and I had nothing to do. I wanted to study, but I couldn't go to university for another year, and so I thought only about Lucy and her pretty face. We were much too young for an engagement, but I had to keep my promise. But how did Lucy and Robert get married? Eleanor asked. Robert went to talk to Lucy. You can't marry Edward, he told her. It's very bad for the family. He went to see her 2 or 3 times, and you can guess the rest. He was pleased to take her from me, and I didn't have enough money for her. My mother is very angry with them, but Robert is still her favourite, and she'll give him something. Edward agreed to stay at their house for a week, and he and Eleanor had some very happy days together. They talked about everything. But Edward, she said, you were engaged to Lucy, and she spent a lot of time with me. Wasn't that wrong? At first you were just a friend, but then I began to realise my feelings for you. Yes, it was dangerous, and I had to leave, but I couldn't leave you at once, he said. Colonel Brandon arrived, and the 2 men were soon good friends. Edward would be the priest for the Colonel's village soon, but money was still a problem for him and Eleanor. They did not need a lot, but they did need enough to live on. Then John Dashwood wrote to her. Mrs. Ferris wants to see Edward again. She is ready to forgive him. Yes, but she doesn't know about our engagement, Edward said. Finally, he went to see his mother. She was very glad to see him. Eleanor was not as good as Miss Morton, but at last she agreed to his new engagement. She gave them enough money so that they could marry comfortably. After the wedding, John Dashwood visited the happy pair in their new home. Well, dear sister, he said, you are lucky, it's true. But I would prefer to have Colonel Brandon for my brother. He has a much better house. Perhaps Marianne. He doesn't love her yet, but maybe he will soon. You must encourage her, Eleanor. Yes, you must encourage them both. Marianne was a very unusual girl. She loved a man when she was old enough to love him deeply. But she finally forgot him and married another. She was 19 then, and her new husband, Colonel Brandon, you will remember, was already an old man, but they were very happy together, and Marianne soon loved him with all her heart. Mrs. Dashwood continued to live at Barton, but went to see her 2 daughters very often. They were, of course, living near their mother, Marianne in Delaford Park and Eleanor in the priest's house in the village, and Mrs. Dashwood wasn't unhappy at home. Margaret was old enough to go to dances now, and her mother could think about a husband for her too. So that's the end of the book. Esse é o fim do nosso livro, ok? Nós lemos em 3 partes o livro Sense and Sensibility. Eu espero que você gostou de ler esse livro comigo. E nós vamos analisar, conversar sobre esse livro lá no nosso grupo de Telegram. Se você gostou desse projeto do Book Club, deixa seu comentário, seu feedback para mim. Eu gosto muito de ouvir as histórias e os contos de vocês, de que vocês estão gostando do conteúdo que eu crio aqui nas redes sociais. Eu espero que você gostou da história desse livro e mês que vem, se Deus quiser, vamos ter outro livro juntos, ok? So take care, keep on reading, and I'll see you again soon. Take care, guys.